apart from all the assignments we had from school, and that takes a lot of skill actually, surprisingly. On top of all this, we also had to evaluate all sources, which was kind of a new skill that we had to develop because we hadn't done much of it before, and it took a while to get used to note down every source we used and write a paragraph about it, and sometimes this paragraph would be longer than what I found from the source. Another challenge for me was finding a variety of sources because it's not a very common topic, and for example, you can always find everything on the internet, but looking at books, it's difficult to get your hands on books on something so specific. But I did manage to find some books which did add valuable information to my process, especially when it came to DIY stuff, so how to make the dyes itself. The strength of my project was definitely my research. It was the longest part as well, and it was really the foundation of everything I did because I had no prior knowledge of this topic before. And I think another strength would be my attention to the ALI, the area of interaction, because
the most common phobias for humans, and I got things like that I would have expected, like arachnophobia, which is the fear of spiders, and I knew that was pretty common. But I also got some unexpected data, which is things like social phobia and agoraphobia, which is the fear of social situations, fear of embarrassing yourself, the fear of being in a situation that you can't escape from. And these may seem obvious, but you don't really think about them. I also researched horror stories that have already been written. I looked up famous authors like Edgar Allan Poe and Anthony Horowitz and Neil Gaiman, who are already some of my favorite authors. Just to look at the style and the structure of their story. Even though I've written stories before, I've never really used the horror genre before, so I wasn't really familiar with that style of writing. So it was definitely something that I had to familiarize myself with to use later. So obviously the next step after research was actually applying the information that I learned. And I actually found it was actually pretty easy for me to apply what I had learned. The thing that I used most often in my stories was to make it seem just like a normal story at first, and then towards the very end, just basically tie it all together and turn it into something that you would never expect. And I've seen that done with Edgar Allan Poe and Anthony Horowitz most often. Neil Gaiman usually has the kind of horror theme running all the way through the story. And I did have that aspect in a couple of my stories, but for some reason I just felt drawn to the twist ending. And the people who I tested my product on actually thought the same way. And since I was gearing my project towards people of my age group, that was actually a smart decision on my part. But I wrote 5 stories, and I mean, for story writing it's really a creative and innovative process, so you can't really put specifications to it. So I didn't really have very many specifications. I knew that I wanted to write 5 stories. That was a pretty challenging number, even if they're short stories. The act of, thinking up these ideas and writing them down is pretty complicated. So I did find that the right level. It was challenging, but it was doable. And I also knew that I wanted to have around about 1,000 words per story, more or less. So this is, give or take, 5,000 words of writing that I've done. Obviously, the main weakness of my stories was that I hadn't written the horror genre before. But also, I found that without inspiration, it's very difficult to write. I think there are about 2 stories in here that I actually had inspiration for beforehand, and I had the idea for beforehand. But the rest of them was really hard to write because I kind of had to force myself to think of ideas. And that was actually reflected in my survey at the end. Because funnily enough, the 2 stories that I had the inspiration for beforehand, that I kind of had the raw ideas for, that I had to develop, were the most popular. So really what it comes down to is inspiration. If you're not motivated to do something, then it's not going to come out as well as something that you're really inspired to do. I definitely learned more about human ingenuity throughout my project. I've never really had to take something and apply it in this same way. I didn't really copy the styles of the authors that I looked at. I do have my own style of writing, and I think that's definitely reflected in my stories. But I did have to kind of structure them in a certain way in order to get the effect that I wanted. I also had to use different psychological techniques, which I learned about throughout my project. For example, one of the stories I chose to write in first-person present tense. And that actually makes the reader identify more with the main character. So you'll feel more of the emotions that they feel going through the story. And it really helps you to connect more with the story itself, so maybe you'll be more surprised at a surprising event, or in this case, more scared if something scary happens, because you feel like you're in that story. And I think that was definitely one of the more interesting psychological techniques that I learned and applied. So at the end, as I said before, I gave a survey to everyone. I gave 10 people my stories to read and had them fill out a survey. And the funny thing was, the 2 stories that I was most inspired to write were actually the most in conflict with each other, because the styles were a bit different, and the people who really liked one story didn't like the other so much. So really it's a matter of personal preference, what style someone likes. And I think that the writer
from people is what you see is what you get. And I felt that also applied to the pyramids here. But nobody really wonders what's on the inside. For example, here you see the king's, the pharaoh's chamber and the queen's chamber. Before starting the project, I had no idea that beforehand, before a king or a queen would be buried, their servants would also have to die with them in order and be mummified with them in great respect to carry them on into the afterlife and ensure that they really would survive in the afterlife. However accurate that is up to debate, but a second part of my project, apart from the philosophical part or historical part, was the mathematical part and the architecture in it. Just this alone took me about a week, 2 weeks to do. It was very hard, actually. The 52 degrees here is considered the golden angle for building pyramids, mainly because it's the angle that shapes the rest of the pyramid. If you'd like to pass this around. Let's see. The area of interaction that I chose was human ingenuity. If you don't mind, I'd like to read what the IB or MIP says. What the MIP says human ingenuity is. Human ingenuity emphasizes both the importance of researching the developments made by people across space, time, and cultures, and the importance of taking time to reflect on these developments. In this way, human ingenuity goes behind the creation alone, leading students to examine, experience, and reflect on the creative process. I felt that really suited my personal project to the point, and that was perfect for me. Another point about my personal project that I actually really liked was where would we be now if this never was built? All the technology that was put into this thousands of years ago, the levees, the pulleys, the 10,000 slaves to build this, an estimated amount, but still, it's a lot of people. Where would we be now if this was never built, minus this technology? We might not, I mean, everything that's happened so far in history has led us to this point here. And if this would never happen, it's unthinkable. We might be living in the 70s. And so I felt that this was very interesting. Other than that, I also wanted to explore my own culture, as I've already said. And thank you, that was my personal project.
Great.
My OI was area of interaction was human ingenuity, because human ingenuity is all about creation, looking at how we create, why we create, and what consequences creation has. If there's any questions, as I said before, I think keep them till the end. I'll be happy to answer them then. Okay, so I started this project by looking into who I was. I think it's a question that you would think to be an easy one, but you know, it took me quite a while to kind of figure that out. I handed out interviews to some of my close friends and family, and asked them who they thought I was, which gives you an insight into how people see you and also can give you an insight into who you actually are. I then moved on to researching bands and artists that write their own songs and looking into their methods and their genres and how they create what they do. And then I looked at the actual songwriting and how people go about doing that and how the best way for me to approach it. And once I got to this research, I started with the actual kind of putting together of the song. I took words that came up a lot in interviews and I put them in my specifications, which are in my report. And then I started building lyrics around these words and then slowly forming that into a song. Yeah. So along the road of this creation, there are both good and bad decisions and both strengths and weaknesses in my product. One of the best decisions I made was starting as early on as possible. I started right at the beginning of the summer with researching and interviewing and looking at different bands and whatnot, and that gave me a huge head start on the rest of the project. I also set my own smaller and easier to handle deadlines throughout the product and the project, which made everything seem less daunting throughout. Because I mean, you can get a deadline saying you have to hand in your draft in January, but if you think, okay, I have to have my introduction done by December, etc.
50 to 60 minutes every time. The students completed a relevant activity that helped them to learn. For example, we did explorers and the students were able to create their own maps. The following week we did Leonardo da Vinci and the students were able to do mirror writing or to create a death mask. And the last week we did painting and they were able to create a replica of one of the 3 paintings, either Primavera, the creation of Adam, or the birth of Venus. There were lots of strengths and weaknesses about this project. The biggest weakness was that I had to change it in about November. My question was originally different. It was to teach 9 to 10-year-olds, so I had to sort of revamp my product, but that kind of helped to make it stronger, I believe. I've learned a lot from my project this year. I want to study history at university and I also want to teach in the future. So this product has helped me to understand exactly what goes into teaching and to have a lot more respect for my teachers from MP1 and 2 that had to deal with 24 crazy running around students, and it helped, it furthered my love for history and for teaching.